There's a yard in Tappen, British Columbia that looks like the world's greatest automotive graveyard. Acres of rusting steel, forgotten muscle cars, vintage trucks half swallowed by weeds. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a dreadlocked Canadian with a lifelong obsession he couldn't explain, and a friendship that quietly became the backbone of one of the most unlikely shows on Netflix. But as the cameras kept rolling and the seasons kept coming, something shifted between Mike Hall and the man standing beside him, and once it did, nothing about Rust Valley Restorers was ever quite the same. Mike Hall wasn't supposed to be on television. He was a rock blaster by trade, a man who spent decades detonating hillsides for a living through his slope stabilization company, Chimera Springs Rock Works. By the time he was deep into his 50s, he'd quietly amassed over 400 rusting cars on a piece of land near the Trans-Canada Highway in Tappen, BC. He'd tell you it was a collection. Everyone else would call it a problem. In 2016, he tried to sell the whole thing, cars, land, and all, and got zero offers. So in 2017, he raised the price out of frustration. The story went viral, and suddenly his phone wouldn't stop ringing. Producers came calling. The idea of a restoration show was pitched. And the man who'd spent 40 years hoarding rust said yes to cameras in 3 days. But here's what people often miss about that origin story. Mike Hall wasn't a restorer. He was a collector. He loved buying cars, not necessarily fixing them. If this show was going to work, he needed someone who could actually turn those rusted hulks into something worth watching. Someone with the mechanical knowledge to back up the drama. And he already knew exactly who that was. A very chauffeur had been Mike's friend for over 15 years before a single camera ever pointed at either of them. He was a local guy from the Shuswap region, a former heavy equipment repairman whose own company Tappen Business had folded on him. A 2018 attempt to get his own car restoration operation off the ground went nowhere. He was between chapters, skilled, restless, and just available enough to say yes when Mike needed a team built in 72 hours. Avery stepped into Rust Bros as a mechanic and quickly became the shop manager. More than that, he became the show's secret weapon. His nickname, Muscle Car MacGyver, said everything. While Mike was the charismatic frontman with the dreadlocks and the stories, Avery was the guy who actually understood what was wrong with a 40-year-old engine at a glance. He was Mike's first call on any car before a single wrench turned. Mike's son Connor had even worked under Avery before the show started, treating him less like his dad's buddy and more like a mentor. That dynamic, Mike's reckless passion, Avery's straight-talking pragmatism, and Connor's constant attempts to keep the finances from imploding, became the engine of everything. Not the cars, the people. Rust Valley Restorers premiered on the History Channel Canada in December 2018. By August 2019, it had landed on Netflix. And virtually overnight, a car restoration show from a small town in British Columbia was being watched in nearly 200 countries. The formula was simple but irresistible. Mike would fall in love with something he couldn't afford to restore. Avery would tell him he was out of his mind. Connor would present the math. Mike would do it anyway, repeat, and viewers couldn't get enough. But by the time Season 3 rolled around, cracks in that formula were starting to show. Not dramatic blow-ups, not screaming matches, but something quieter and arguably more telling. Avery put a sign outside his own property. Wildman Restorations was open for business. He'd been building toward this quietly for a while, believing and saying openly that running his own shop would actually save their friendship rather than damage it. When you're bickering daily over every spend decision in someone else's business, the relationship takes the hit. Going independent meant the tension had somewhere else to go. His son Shafeen joined him at Wildman to start, and fans immediately noticed Avery's reduced presence inside the Rust Bros garage and started asking hard questions about what exactly was happening. Was he leaving the show? Had something gone wrong between them? The speculation ran hot online, with viewers convinced they were watching a friendship quietly come apart at the seams. But when Season 4 arrived, Mike himself addressed it directly. Avery was still in every episode. They were still working together on builds. The shops were separate, but the partnership wasn't dead. Avery's own explanation was just as straightforward. He had his own projects backing up, his own ideas he couldn't get to while running someone else's operation. It wasn't a falling out. It was an exit strategy dressed up as loyalty to himself. That said, Season 4 brought a storyline that hit fans harder than any behind-the-scenes split ever could. Mike was running out of road, forest fires were threatening the region, land use restrictions were tightening, and the bills at Rust Bros weren't going away. The decision that had been looming for years finally arrived. Mike had to sell his iconic Field of Dreams, the 500-plus car collection he'd spent 4 decades assembling. Avery and Connor, in a gesture that said more about the real state of their friendship than any camera drama could, sat down and gave Mike a list of 10 cars he should keep before everything else went to auction. Mike, being Mike, walked away with 52. He couldn't help it. But the collection, the one that started the whole story, was essentially gone. He told the press it brought him relief. No more burden on his family, no more cars he'd never get to. Just the shop, the builds, and whatever came next. What came next took longer than anyone expected. After the Season 4 finale aired in mid-2022, there was silence. Avery went quiet on social media for months. Fan forums filled up with theories. Had the show finally run out of road? Was the auction the last chapter? Then in April 2023, Avery resurfaced on Instagram with a message to his followers. He was back. Wildman Restorations was still running, and he was ready to be more present online. And behind the scenes, something bigger was brewing. Season 5 of Rust Valley Restorers premiered on September 19, 2024, on the History Channel, and both men were back. Mike, now nearly 68 years old, reflected on what the ride had been. He started filming at 60, wound up on Netflix in 190 countries, and still couldn't quite explain how any of it happened. Avery was there too, tackling his own builds independently, including a 1974 Austin Mini complete with a Union Jack on the roof. And in typical fashion, the two of them crammed into the finished car together for a test drive that became one of the season's most talked about moments. Separate shops, same friendship, same chemistry. That's the thing about what Mike Hall and Avery Schoaf built together that gets lost in the split narrative fans love to tell. They never actually ran the same business. Even during the Rust Bros years, Avery was a contributor, not a co-owner. He brought his skills, his personality, and his friendship to Mike's operation. But Wildman Restorations wasn't born out of a falling out. It was born out of a man who had his own ideas and finally had the platform to pursue them. The real drift wasn't personal, it was professional. And even that drift left enough of a thread between them that they've never truly separated. But here's the question that lingers over all of it. The show worked because of friction. Not the manufactured kind, but the genuine tension between two different philosophies living under the same roof. Mike the dreamer, Avery the realist. When that friction moved to different buildings, the dynamics shifted. The debate that used to happen across a workbench now happens across town. And whether that change sharpened the show or softened it is something every viewer seems to have a different answer for. What's undeniable is this. Two ordinary guys from a small town in British Columbia stumbled into something neither of them planned, and they made it work for 5 seasons across 2 continents and millions of viewers. The partnership that built Rust Valley Restorers isn't over, but it's not the same as it was in that garage in Season 1 either. And sometimes that's the most honest story a show can tell.